Bedroom was dark, not fully dark. The streetlight outside pressed a thin line of orange through the gap in the curtains, falling across the foot of the bed the way it always had, every night for 6 years in that house. Thomas Acaffer knew the shape of that light the way he knew the creak of the third stair and the particular rattle of the kitchen window when the wind came from the north. He knew this house the way a restoration architect knows any structure he has lived inside long enough, not just its dimensions. Its habits, its sounds, the small private language of a building that has settled into itself. He lay on his side facing the wall. His breathing was even. His eyes were open. Renee was whispering. She had picked up the phone at 2:17 in the morning. He had been awake since 2, lying in the particular stillness of a man whose body has stopped sleeping even though nothing has told him why. He had felt her move. Felt the careful, deliberate quality of it, the practiced way she lifted the covers and shifted her weight without creating the sounds that would wake a sleeping person. Then the soft light of her screen in the dark. Then the click of the bedroom door not quite closing. She had gone to the sitting room. He waited. 3 minutes. 4. Then she came back. She left the door ajar this time, the way a person does when they have decided their sleeping husband is deeply enough under that it no longer matters. She sat on the edge of her side of the bed and she began to speak. He did not move. What Thomas Acaffer heard over the next 22 minutes, lying completely still in the dark with his eyes open and the orange line of light across the foot of the bed, was not a fragment. It was not a suggestion. It was a complete and specific account of a relationship that had been running for 11 months, delivered in the low, unhurried voice of a woman who believed the person beside her was asleep and therefore not present. He did not move, not when she said the man's name, not when she described the plan she had begun constructing in increments over the previous months, the careful repositioning of certain shared assets, the language she had already rehearsed for the conversation she intended to have with Thomas in the spring. Not when she laughed, briefly and quietly, at something the man said in response. Not when she said, in a voice as easy as a woman reading from a list she had already memorized, "He trusts everything I tell him. That's always been the easiest thing about him." He lay still. He breathed. He let it be exactly what it was, the full catastrophic weight of it settling over him in the dark like a structure finding its new level after something beneath it has given way. He did not move because there was nothing useful in moving. There was nothing that a reaction, however warranted, however human, would clarify or repair or recover. He understood this with the part of his mind that had spent 17 years working inside buildings that had been damaged and needed to be made sound again. You do not begin the work in the moment of discovery. You document the damage first. You understand the full extent of it. You do not touch the structure until you know what you are dealing with. He lay still until she ended the call. He lay still while she set the phone on the nightstand. He lay still while her breathing changed and deepened, and she slept. He stared at the orange line of light across the foot of the bed. In the morning, he made one phone call. Thomas Acaffer had grown up understanding that buildings tell the truth about the people who built them. His father had been a civil engineer in Lagos, a man who believed that the discipline of structures was a moral discipline, that a poorly built thing was not just a technical failure but an ethical one, that every corner cut and every load miscalculated was a decision made at someone else's expense. Thomas had heard this argument so many times before he was 10 that it had become the furniture of his thinking, the frame on which everything else was arranged. He came to the United States at 19 for his undergraduate degree and never went back to live, though he went back to visit every few years, to walk through neighborhoods his father had worked in, to see what had held and what had not. He got his architecture degree at Ohio State. He got his graduate degree at Michigan. He spent 3 years at a large firm in Chicago doing commercial work that paid well and felt hollow, and then he took a position with a small historic preservation practice in Columbus and understood immediately that he had found the thing he was supposed to do. Restoration was not glamorous work. It did not produce buildings that appeared in architecture magazines or won design awards. What it produced was the recovery of things that were worth keeping. Old courthouses, century-old schools, industrial buildings whose bones were extraordinary, and whose surfaces had been damaged by neglect or renovation, or the well-intentioned incompetence of people who had not understood what they were working with. Thomas moved through these structures the way his father had moved through his, with attention and with patience, and with the particular respect of a man who understands that the thing in front of him existed before he arrived and will outlast him if he does his work correctly. He was not famous. He did not want to be famous. He wanted the buildings to hold. He had his own practice by 34. 3 employees, a small office in the short north, a reputation that had been built entirely by the quality of his work and the recommendations of people who had seen it. He had turned down larger commissions when they conflicted with projects he cared about more. He had taken on pro bono work for municipal buildings in neighborhoods that did not have the budgets to preserve what deserved to be preserved. He was not wealthy in the way of people who optimize for wealth. He was solvent and stable, and doing the work that mattered to him, which was its own kind of wealth. Renee had come into his life at 33, through a mutual friend at a dinner party that neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. She was a project manager at a healthcare consulting firm, organized and sharp-minded and direct in a way that Thomas had found refreshing. She asked good questions. She was comfortable with silence in the way of people who do not need it filled. She had strong opinions about things she had thought carefully about and soft opinions about things she hadn't, which Thomas respected as an accurate relationship with certainty. They had dated for 2 years and married at 35 and 33. A modest ceremony, both families present, his Aunt Adiz flying in from Houston, where she had retired after 30 years practicing immigration law. The reception was in a restored Victorian in Clintonville that Thomas had helped save from demolition 8 years earlier. He had chosen it specifically, and Renee had understood why without needing to be told. The house they bought the following year was a 1930s craftsman bungalow in Bexley, the kind of house that had good bones and needed attention. Thomas had restored it methodically over the first 3 years of their marriage, evenings and weekends, stripping the paint layers back to original surfaces, repointing the masonry, replacing the rotted porch columns with pieces he had turned himself on a lathe in his father's tradition. He had drawn a site plan of the property before he began, a detailed hand-drawn document showing the existing conditions and the intended restoration, and he had kept it in the front pocket of his work bag throughout the project. The habit of carrying it had never quite stopped. The plan was still there, updated occasionally, a private record of the house as it had been and as he had made it. Renee had loved the house in the early years, or she had seemed to love it. She had moved through its restored rooms with the particular satisfaction of someone who appreciates having been given a good thing, and Thomas had been glad of that. He had built it for her as much as for himself. That was, he understood now, the thing about building things for people. You can build something with the full honesty of your skill and your intention and your love. That does not determine what the other person does with it. The first signals had been quiet. He had noticed them the way he noticed things, carefully, without announcing. The practice of a man who moves through damaged buildings and has trained himself to see what is actually there rather than what he expected to find. Renee had changed her phone habits 11 months ago. He had marked it not as a date, but as a shift, a gradual rotation away from the openness of the first years toward something more private. The phone angled away at dinner. The bathroom door closed when it had not been closed before. Brief pauses before she answered a question that should not have required pausing. He had told himself explanations, work stress, a difficult project, a friendship he did not know well that had become more demanding. He had told himself these things and believed them partially, and set the rest aside in the part of his mind where he kept things that were not yet ready to be named. He had not expected the night of the phone call, not because the signals had been absent, but because he had been good at not expecting it. He had been, in Renee's own words, lying in the dark in his own bed, the easiest thing. He lay still until she was asleep. Then he lay still for another 2 hours. He went through everything he could account for, the financial picture, The house, both names on the deed, the equity of 6 years of mortgage payments plus the restoration value Thomas had added with his own labor. The joint accounts. The investment account they had opened together 4 years ago, built from both their incomes. His practice, established before the marriage, a sole proprietorship, no marital funds invested. He went through each asset the way he surveyed a structure, systematically in order, noting what was his and what was shared and what might be in motion. He thought about the spring. She had said she had a plan for the spring. He thought about the investment account. He thought about the phone call she did not know he had heard. At 6 in the morning, while Renee was still asleep, he dressed in the dark without turning on the light. He went downstairs. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table in the house he had restored room by room, and he drank the coffee, and he looked at the surface of the table, and he let the full weight of the night settle completely. Then he picked up his phone. He called his Aunt Adiz. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was already up, which she always was by 5:30 regardless of time zone. Her voice was the voice he had heard all his life at the important moments, warm and entirely without softness, in the particular way of a woman who has spent 30 years inside legal proceedings and no longer wastes a word. "Thomas," she said. Her tone registered his tone immediately. "Say it plainly." He told her, plainly. The call he had overheard, the 11 months, the plan for the spring, the investment account. The words she had used, "He trusts everything I tell him." That's always been the easiest thing about him. Adiz was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of a woman processing information through a legal mind that had never stopped working, not even in retirement. She said, "You have not confronted her." He said, "No." She said, "Good." She said, "You will not confront her yet." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you writing everything down?" He said, "Not yet. I called you first." She said, "Write it down now." Date, time, duration of the call, every specific thing you remember her saying. Everything. Do it before the day takes you somewhere else and the details soften. He got a legal pad from the drawer beside the refrigerator. He wrote while she talked. She asked him questions in the methodical sequence of a woman who has done intake interviews for 30 years. The investment account. What institution, what balance approximately, were both names listed as co-owners? Had he noticed any transactions he would not have expected? He answered each one. The house. Was the mortgage current? What was the approximate equity? Had either of them refinanced or taken out any credit lines recently? He answered. The practice. Sole proprietorship established before marriage, no marital funds invested, he was certain. She noted this. Write all of that down too, she said. He wrote. Then she said, "I'm going to give you a name. His name is Franklin Ez. He was my colleague for 12 years in Houston, and he moved to Columbus in 2018. He practices family law. He is the most thorough man I have ever watched work inside a courtroom, and he does not like to lose asset cases." She paused. "You will call him this morning. Tell him I sent you. Tell him everything you told me." Thomas wrote the name. He said, "Auntie." She said, "I know." He said, "When did you?" She said, "I didn't know, I suspected. And I did not say anything because suspicion is not evidence, and I did not want to wound you on something I could not prove." She was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about whether that was the right decision many times since you called." He said, "It was." She said, "Call Franklin this morning." He said, "I will." She said, "Thomas." She said his name the way she had always said it, the full weight of 30 years of loving him placed in 2 syllables without performance. "You are going to be all right." He said, "I know." He ended the call. He looked at the legal pad, 2 full pages in his own handwriting, dates and times and specific phrases and the structure of the financial accounts. He folded the pages and put them in the front pocket of his work bag, next to the site plan of the house. He finished his coffee. He called Franklin Ez at 8:15, when the office opened. Franklin Ez's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Broad Street, the kind of office that conveyed exactly what it needed to convey. Meticulous, unhurried, every document in its correct place. Franklin himself was a compact man in his early 50s, with a stillness about him that Thomas recognized immediately as the stillness of someone who had learned that the person who stays calmest in a difficult room usually wins it. He wore a dark suit with no tie. He shook Thomas's hand with both of his and said, "Adiz called me 20 minutes ago. "Sit down, tell me everything." Thomas told him everything. He produced the legal pad. Franklin read both pages without interrupting, then looked up and asked 11 questions in sequence, the same questions Adiz had asked but with additional specificity. What was the approximate balance in the investment account? When had it last been reviewed? Was Thomas listed as the primary contact on the account? Had he noticed any changes to any automatic transfers or beneficiary designations in recent months? Thomas answered each one. Franklin made notes. He wrote quickly and without crossing anything out, the hand of a man who thinks before he writes rather than writing to think. He said, "I want to move carefully here, quickly but carefully. There's a difference." Thomas said, "I understand that difference." Franklin looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I believe you do." They spent 90 minutes together. Franklin outlined the process, the financial disclosures that would be required, the documentation Thomas needed to begin gathering, the asset picture as Franklin understood it from what Thomas had described, and the specific vulnerabilities within that picture that needed to be shored up before any formal action was taken. The investment account, Franklin said, was the immediate priority. If she has a plan for the spring and she mentioned specific assets in the call, we need to make sure that account is appropriately protected before she decides to act. "How do I do that without her knowing I'm doing it?" Thomas said. "You contact the institution directly," Franklin said. "You're listed as a co-owner. You have the right to request notification of any changes, any transfer requests, any beneficiary modifications. You set up a flag. They call you before anything moves." Thomas said, "Can I do that without it showing up as a change she would notice?" Franklin said, "Yes, it's an account service request, routine. She won't see it unless she specifically asks, and she has no reason to ask." Thomas said, "When?" Franklin said, "Today, this afternoon, before 5. Thomas was at the investment institution by 2:30. He sat across from a client services representative named Patricia who was professional and unhurried, and helped him set the notification protocol in less than 30 minutes. He confirmed his contact information. He confirmed the notification preferences. He thanked her. He was back at his office by 3:15. He sat at his desk and looked at the current project file, a 19th century schoolhouse in Franklinton that the city had designated for preservation, and that Thomas's practice had been hired to assess and restore. The assessment drawings were spread across his desk, pencil lines and notation, the careful documentation of a building's condition before the work of repair begins. He looked at the drawings for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Bernard Cole. Bernard had been a contractor in Columbus for 30 years. He and Thomas had worked together on 11 restoration projects. He was a large, unhurried man with a white beard and the specific credibility of someone who has never once in 30 years told a client something that turned out not to be true. Thomas trusted him with the same unqualified trust he extended to very few people. He told Bernard in general terms, "Not everything. Enough." Bernard listened without asking unnecessary questions. When Thomas finished, Bernard said, "You need anything, you call." Then he said, "You eating?" Thomas said, "I'm fine." Bernard said, "That isn't what I asked." Thomas said, "I'll eat." Bernard said, "Good, then I have a slow cooker situation going at the house tonight. Come at 6 if you want. No requirement to talk about anything." Thomas said he'd be there. He was there. He ate. He did not talk about Renee. Bernard did not ask about Renee. They talked about the Franklinton schoolhouse, and an adjacent building Bernard had heard was also coming up for assessment, and whether the city's preservation budget would be adequate or, as had historically been the case, approximately 40% of what was actually required. They argued about this with the comfortable familiarity of people who had been arguing about the same city's same budgeting failures for 15 years and had no expectation of resolution. Thomas drove home at 9. Renee was in the living room with her laptop. She looked up when he came in and said she had made dinner, that it was in the refrigerator if he wanted it. He said thank you. He said the schoolhouse project had run long. She nodded and returned to her screen. He went upstairs. He changed his clothes. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about Franklin's process, the sequence of steps, the specific order in which each piece needed to be put in place before the picture was complete. He thought about the spring she had been planning for. He thought about the words she had used on the phone, easy and unhurried, describing a man she had lived beside for 6 years as though he were a feature of the landscape rather than its architect. He breathed. He slept. The days that followed had a particular surface texture, ordinary and intact from the outside, with everything below it changed. Thomas moved through them with the patience of a man who has learned that a restoration project cannot be rushed, that the work reveals itself on its own schedule, and that the only response to that is sustained attention. He went to the office. He worked on the schoolhouse drawings. He answered Franklin's requests for documents, producing each one with the same organized thoroughness he brought to a project file: tax returns, business account statements, mortgage records, the investment account history going back 4 years. He organized everything in the format Franklin had specified and delivered it by the end of the week. Renee moved through the same house as if nothing had shifted. She was present and functional and occasionally warm in the way she had been warm in the years before the warmth had begun to hollow out from the inside. She made dinner twice that week. She asked about the Franklinton project. She told him about a difficult client she was managing. He listened. He responded. He gave her nothing she could use and took nothing at face value. He was not performing normalcy. He was working inside it, the way you work inside a damaged building, carefully, without disturbing anything prematurely, documenting what you find. He thought sometimes during this period about what it would have meant to react, to come home the morning after the phone call and say, "I heard you." He had considered it. He had measured the value of it and found it insufficient. A confrontation in that moment would have given her information she did not yet have, which was that he knew the full shape of the plan. It would have moved money and altered behavior and made the documentation harder to compile. The only advantage of reacting immediately was the emotional satisfaction of it, which was real but which could be deferred. He was good at deferring things. That had always been the easiest thing about him. He knew now that it did not have to be easy for others at his expense. It could be easy for him because it was his nature and his discipline, and it could serve him. That was a different thing entirely. Adiz called on Thursday evening. She asked if he had spoken with Franklin. He said yes. She asked if the account notification was in place. He said yes. She said, "Good." Then she said, "How are you sleeping?" He said, "Adequately." She said, "Thomas." He said, "Some nights better than others." She said, "That's honest." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something I have been thinking about since you called me." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I have known Renee for 6 years. I have watched her with you. I have sat across from her at your table." She paused. "She is not a cruel person. I want you to be able to hold that alongside everything else, because the truth is rarely as simple as cruelty. She was someone who wanted something and found a way to get it that did not account for what it would cost someone she should not have been willing to cost. That is its own kind of failure, but it is not malice." Thomas was quiet. She said, "I am not asking you to forgive that. Forgiveness is your business in your own time. I'm just asking you not to simplify it into something smaller than it actually is, because you are too careful a thinker to do that, and it would not serve you." He said, "I know who she is." She said, "I know you do." He said, "That's what made it easy for her." Adiz said nothing for a moment. Then, "Yes, that's exactly right. And the same quality that made it easy for her is the quality that is going to carry you through this without losing yourself. Understand that clearly." He did. The complication arrived on a Thursday at 11 in the morning, 22 days after the phone call. Franklin called. His voice was level and precise, which meant he was managing something. He said, "She moved." Thomas went still. Franklin said, "This morning, the investment account. A transfer request was submitted at 9:47. Partial withdrawal, $60,000 to an external account." Thomas said, "Was it processed?" Franklin said, "No. The notification flag you set came through to me at 10:15. I contacted the institution immediately and placed a temporary hold pending verification. We have 24 hours before they need a formal legal instrument to extend the hold." Thomas said, "What do I need to do?" Franklin said, I'm filing an emergency motion this afternoon for a temporary restraining order on joint asset transfers pending the formal divorce proceedings. I need you here by 1 o'clock to sign the supporting declaration. Thomas was at Franklin's office at 12:45. He signed the declaration. Franklin had it filed by 2:30. The judge signed the TRO at 4:57. The investment account was frozen. Franklin called him at 5:15. He said, "It's in place." Thomas said, "She's going to know now." Franklin said, "Yes. The institution will notify her that the transfer was rejected pursuant to a court order. She'll know by end of day." He paused. "It accelerates the timeline. We were going to file the petition next week. I'm moving it to tomorrow morning." Thomas said, "Do it." He drove home that evening at his normal time. He was not angry. He was not shaking. He was the man who had lain in the dark and not moved because what was required was not reaction. What was required was exactly this: the steady, methodical, legally airtight exercise of knowing what you are dealing with and responding with the full precision of someone who has been paying attention. Renee was in the kitchen when he arrived. She had her phone in her hand, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who has just received news and has been standing in one spot deciding what to do with it. She said his name. He set his bag on the counter. He said, "I know about the transfer." She said, "Thomas, I can explain," he said. "I'm not going to ask you to explain tonight," she said. "There are things you don't understand about what's been happening, about how I've been feeling." She stepped toward him. "If you would let me," he said, "Renee." He said her name with the same quality of stillness he had held in the dark 2 weeks ago, the complete absence of performance. He said, "I heard the phone call." She stopped. He looked at her and let the sentence sit. "I heard it," he said. 11 months. The plan for the spring. The account." He paused. "And the part where you told him that I trust everything you tell me, that was always the easiest thing about me." The kitchen was very quiet. Renee's face moved through several things. Calculation first, then the calculation failing. Then something underneath it, not quite shame, but the close neighbor of shame, the particular expression of a person who has been found out not just in the action but in the analysis of the action, which is something different and harder to recover from. She said, "I didn't know you were awake." He said, "I know you didn't." She said, "How long?" He said, "From the beginning." The silence came back. She said, "Thomas." Her voice had changed, the prepared version gone, something rower beneath it. "I am sorry. I know that's not enough. I know I cannot explain it in a way that makes it," he said. "You don't need to explain it to me." He picked up his bag. "The petition will be filed tomorrow morning. You'll be formally served. You should call an attorney tonight." He looked at her one last time. "I am not angry with you. I want you to hear that clearly. I am not doing this out of anger." He walked out of the kitchen. He went to the study. He sat at his desk. He opened the Franklinton file and looked at the drawings for a while without seeing them. Then he closed the file. He reached into his work bag and took out the site plan of the house, the hand-drawn document he had made before the restoration began, annotated over the years in his own pencil, a record of the house as it had been and as he had made it. He looked at it for a long time. He put it back. He went to bed. He slept through the night. The petition was served the following morning at Renee's office by a process server who arrived at 10:15 while she was in a staff meeting and waited at the front desk until she was brought out. She called Thomas 40 minutes later. He did not answer. He forwarded the call to Franklin. The days after the filing had a different texture from the days before. The surface was no longer intact. Both of them moved through the house knowing the shape of what was happening, and the house, which Thomas had spent 3 years restoring with the intention of it lasting, reflected back the particular silence of a structure that knows it is about to change hands. He moved through his work without disruption. The Franklinton schoolhouse, the ongoing assessments, 2 new commissions, both referred by previous clients, both projects that deserved careful attention. He gave them careful attention. He gave them what his father had given every building he ever touched, the full honesty of his skill, unreduced by what was happening outside it. Adiz flew in for a weekend in the second month. She stayed in the guest room of the house without comment about the fact that Thomas was sleeping in it alone. She made egusi soup on Saturday afternoon because she said he looked like a man who had not been eating enough vegetables, and because she had always expressed love through feeding and saw no reason to change that at 68. They sat at the kitchen table on Saturday evening and ate and talked about things that were not the divorce, and then, at a certain point, talked about the divorce with the directness of two people who had no patience for managing each other. She asked him how he was sleeping. He said, "Better." She said, "The account," he said. "Franklin is confident. The transfer attempt actually helped us. It's documented intent to dissipate marital assets. The judge flagged it in the initial hearing." She said, "Good." Then she looked at him with the particular look she had used since he was a child, the one that meant she was about to say something he needed to hear rather than something he wanted to. She said, "The man she was involved with. Do you know who he is?" He said, "I know his name. Franklin knows more." She said, "Does it matter to you specifically who he is?" He thought about this. He said, "It matters to me that I understand the shape of what happened. It doesn't matter to me personally in the way of wanting to confront him or act against him. He's not the center of this." Adiz nodded slowly. She picked up her soup. She said, "That is a very sound way to see it." He said, "He didn't take anything from me that wasn't already being taken." She said, "Correct." She left Sunday afternoon. She held him for a moment at the door, not dramatically, just with the specific grip of a woman who has been carrying something on behalf of someone she loves and is not yet ready to set it down entirely. She told him to eat more vegetables. He said he would try. Franklin called 2 weeks later with news that reframed one element of the picture completely. His associate had pulled the financial records pursuant to the divorce proceedings and had found something in the credit card statements that Thomas had not known to look for. Over the previous 11 months, a series of charges to a hotel in the short north, the same hotel, roughly twice a month, averaging $300 per visit. The charges had been run on the joint card and categorized in the household budget under miscellaneous, a category Thomas had never scrutinized because the monthly amounts had been small and distributed across other legitimate expenses. The total was $6,400, not a catastrophic amount, but 11 months of the joint account paying for hotel rooms that Thomas had never been told about and had never been in. He sat with this for a moment when Franklin told him. He said, "Add it to the documented record." Franklin said, "Already done." He said, "What does it change legally?" Franklin said, "It strengthens the dissipation argument. Marital funds used for the benefit of the affair. The TRO on the investment account and now the credit card documentation give us a coherent picture of financial conduct that the court will not view favorably." Thomas said, "Good. Then, is there anything else I should know?" Franklin said, "I don't think she had outside help planning this. I think she was working alone. The transfer attempt was not sophisticated. It was impulsive. She panicked when she thought the timeline was accelerating and she moved too fast." Thomas thought about the word impulsive. He thought about the woman on the phone at 2:17 in the morning, unhurried, describing a plan for the spring with the ease of someone who had thought it through carefully. He thought about impulsive and decided the truth was probably somewhere between the plan and the panic. A person can plan carefully and still panic when the plan is interrupted. He said, "All right." He went back to the drawings. The mediation was in April, which was the month she had planned to begin her spring. Thomas did not find any particular irony in the timing. He noted it and set it aside as the kind of coincidence that means nothing and looks like it means something, and is best treated as neither. He arrived with Franklin. Renee arrived with her attorney, a woman named Desmond who was capable and prepared, and had clearly spent the prior weeks helping her client understand what the documented record was going to say about her in this room. The mediator was a retired judge named Harold, who wore reading glasses on his nose and had the specific economy of motion of a man who had spent 30 years deciding things and had developed a precise relationship with the value of time. Harold opened the session by noting that both parties had reviewed the full financial disclosure and that the mediation was intended to resolve the outstanding questions of asset division, the house, and any support considerations without the necessity of a full trial. He noted that the court had already issued a formal finding regarding the attempted transfer of $60,000 from the joint investment account, and that the hotel expenditures from the joint card had been entered into the asset record. He said this without editorial, as a fact being placed on the table so that everyone in the room understood what the table was made of. Renee's attorney made her opening. She was good. She acknowledged the documented conduct and pivoted quickly to her client's contributions to the marriage and the household over 6 years and the proportionate asset consideration that represented. She was clear-eyed and did not overpromise. Franklin's response was precise and patient. He walked through the asset record, the investment account, the attempted transfer, the court's finding. The house equity, the documented restoration work Thomas had contributed that had added measurable value above and beyond the mortgage payments both of them had made. The hotel expenditures. He did not editorials. He let the numbers speak. The conversation that followed was thorough and contained. Thomas answered direct questions directly. He did not perform anything. He did not reach for sympathy, and he did not deliver punishment. He had come to resolve this fairly and efficiently and to leave with what was his. It took 4 hours. The house would be sold. The equity divided according to a formula that accounted for Thomas's documented restoration contribution, which Desmond did not contest because the documentation was too complete to contest. Thomas received a proportionately larger share. The investment account, less the frozen transfer, was divided. The credit card expenditures were factored against Renee's share. There was no spousal support in either direction. They were both employed, both solvent, both capable of sustaining themselves. Harold noted this and neither attorney argued it. By 3 in the afternoon, there was a signed document on the table. Thomas shook Harold's hand. He thanked Franklin. He walked out into the April afternoon, which was bright and still cold at the edges, the particular ambivalence of Ohio in early spring that cannot yet decide what it wants to be. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He thought about the house. He would miss it in the specific way he always missed a project when it was finished and handed over, not with grief exactly, but with the particular clean feeling of a thing completed. He had done good work there. It would hold long after both of them were gone. That was the nature of restoration done correctly. It outlasts the restorer. He thought about the site plan in his work bag. He thought, I will keep it, not for the house. For what it represented, the habit of documenting a thing accurately before you begin the work of making it sound. That habit had not failed him. That habit, applied to everything he had done in the 4 months since the night of the phone call, had produced a record clear enough that the court had read it without difficulty and found in his direction. He walked to his car. He drove to the office. He worked until 7 on the Franklinton schoolhouse, which was at the stage of a project he found most satisfying, past the assessment and the planning, into the actual repair. He and Bernard had walked the site that morning and confirmed that the east exterior wall was structurally sound, which they had both suspected but needed to verify, which was the difference between suspecting a thing and knowing it. At 7, he locked up. He put his bag in the car. He stood for a moment outside the office looking at the short North Street going quiet in the evening, the restaurants filling up, the old buildings in their restored faces holding the last of the light. He thought about Adiz in the kitchen on Saturday evening, the egusi soup, the table, her hand not quite touching his, just near it, available. He took out his phone and called her. She answered on the first ring. He said, "It's done." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in the voice he had known for 39 years, "Tell me," he told her. Simply in order, the way she had taught him to report a thing. She listened without interrupting, the way she had always listened, with complete attention and without performing it. When he finished, she said, "Franklin did well," he said. "Franklin was exceptional," she said. "And you?" He said. "I kept still," she said. "I know," she paused. "That's the hardest thing. Most people can't do it." He said, "You taught me." There was a silence, not empty. The kind that is full of things that do not require being said because they have been understood for 39 years. Then she said, "Eat something." "A real dinner, not from a bag," he said. "Yes, ma'am," she laughed. A real laugh, unguarded. It sounded like home. He ate a real dinner. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. He slept deeply. The house sold in 3 weeks. A young couple came through on the first showing, and on the second showing the woman had walked through every room slowly with her hand trailing along the restored plaster walls and then turned to her husband and said something quietly, and the husband had nodded. The agent called Thomas that evening. He had two feelings simultaneously. They did not cancel each other out. He had restored that house with care and honesty and the full ability of his craft. It would go to people who would live in it and not know his name. He was glad of that. He had never needed the buildings to know his name. He needed them to hold. He signed the closing documents on a Tuesday. He took the check to Franklin's office on a Wednesday. He called his father in Lagos that evening and told him the practice had had a good quarter, which was true, and that the Franklinton schoolhouse was coming along, which was also true. And he did not discuss the divorce because he had told his father in February, and his father had said nothing except "I am sorry." Son and Thomas had understood that as the entirety of what needed to be said. He was 40 years old. He had a restoration practice that was doing the work he had always wanted to do and doing it without apology. He had Bernard, who came by the office once a week for lunch and whose slow cooker situation had become a standing Thursday arrangement that Thomas had stopped trying to decline. He had Adiz, who called twice a week and always ended the call with some version of the vegetable instruction, which he had begun to actually follow because she was right, as she was about most things. He had the Franklinton schoolhouse, which was going to be extraordinary. He had the firehouse in Worthington, which was going to require everything he had and give it all back. He had two craftsmen who trusted his judgment, and a reputation built entirely on the quality of the work rather than its volume. He had, in the final measure, exactly the life he had built, without the parts that had been built on false ground. The false ground was gone. What remained was solid. He had the site plan in his work bag. He had taken it out once after the closing and looked at it for a long time. The original hand-drawn lines, the annotations in pencil, the record of a building before and during and after the work of making it sound. He had thought about keeping it or not keeping it and had decided the decision was not the point. The point was that he had made it. The point was the habit. The accurate documentation of existing conditions as the necessary first step of any honest restoration. He had done it for a house. He had done it for a marriage in the dark, lying still, when the moment required it. He would do it for whatever came next. He put the plan back. Clara Mensah came onto the Franklinton project in June as the structural engineering consultant brought in for the east wall reinforcement. She was 41, tall, precise in her speech, with the particular directness of a person who has spent 2 decades working in a field where ambiguity is expensive. She asked good questions. She looked at problems from the structural consequence back to the cause, which was Thomas's own habit, and they understood each other's reasoning without much translation required. She was not in a hurry about anything. Neither was he. They worked on the east wall through July and into August, meeting twice a week at the site, exchanging documents, debating 2 approaches to the reinforcement beam, and arriving at a third that was better than either of the first 2. This was the kind of collaboration Thomas valued most, not agreeable, not frictionless, but honest and aimed at the right outcome. She mentioned once without drama that she had been through a difficult few years herself. She did not elaborate. He did not ask. The statement landed as information offered without requirement of response, which was how he had learned to offer similar information, and they moved on. In September, after the east wall was certified and the project entered its next phase, she asked him if he wanted to get lunch. He said yes. They ate at a place nearby that she had recommended, and that turned out to be exactly as good as she said it would be, which he noted not as a small thing but as a pattern he was paying attention to. She said what she meant. Things were as good as she said they would be. He drove back to the office afterward and sat at his desk and looked at the Franklinton drawings, which were going well, and at the new commission file that had arrived that morning, a 1920s firehouse in Worthington that had been vacant for 8 years and deserved better than vacancy. He thought, this is a project I want to do. He thought, this is where I am, not triumphant, not healed in the clean, complete way that stories sometimes promise. Just present, just clear about what he was doing and why and with whom and with what materials he was working. He had lain still in the dark while everything shifted beneath him. He had made one phone call, and from that call, with patience and with the same honest attention he had given every structure he had ever been trusted to restore, he had built a record clear enough to stand on. He was exactly where he had decided to be. On the site of every restoration project, before the work begins, there is a moment when you stand inside the damaged building and you understand two things simultaneously: how much has been lost and how much is worth saving. Most people can only see one of those things at a time. The best restorers hold both without flinching because the work requires both: the honest reckoning and the decision to proceed anyway. Thomas Acaffer had always been a man who could hold both. That was the thing that had made him easy to underestimate, and it was the thing in the end that held. If you've stayed with this story until now, you already know what Thomas knew: that patience is not the same thing as passivity, and that the quiet ones are often building something the loud ones never see coming. If that's the kind of story that belongs in your week, subscribe and stay with us. Every story here is built the same way Thomas built, one honest layer at a time.